and today I'm going to talk to you guys about the basics of fishing for catfish. Now catfish, to most people, especially bass anglers, they're considered trash fish, but really, I think they're really fun to catch. They give you a fight that you won't believe. They're also really easy to catch, so catfishing is really fun. Now first, I'm going to talk about the different types of catfish, well the three main types of catfish that people will typically go for. Now the first type is the channel catfish. Now channel catfish, they're pretty easy to catch. They're one of the most common catfish that are in North America. They're really easy to catch, mainly because they'll eat just about anything. They can get at really big size as well. Typically a channel catfish can get to right around 50 pounds, that's the max. But really, channel catfish are one of the easiest ones to catch. Next is the blue catfish. Now blue catfish, they're a little bit harder to catch, mainly because they're a little bit pickier. Typically they like to eat a little bit more small bait fish and stuff. They don't really like to eat dead things that really smell a lot like channel catfish do. Blue catfish you can get a whole lot bigger than channel catfish. They're one of the biggest type of catfish that are in North America. They can get right around 120 pounds. So blue catfish typically they're a little bit harder to catch. Next is the flathead catfish. Now the flathead catfish, they're one of the harder ones to catch, mainly because they're really picky on what they eat. Typically they'll only eat certain types of panfish, bigger bait fish, and usually worms. Typically flatheads, they can be really aggressive and they look sort of ugly at times, but really to most anglers they're considered almost like a game fish, mainly because of how fun how much of a challenge and how fun they are to catch. Now that's basically what I wanted to cover for catfish. Next I'm going to talk about different types of bait to use for catfish. Now certain types of catfish will typically like certain types of baits. For example, like channel catfish, typically channel catfish will only like to eat really stuff that smells or has a really strong odor to it, or usually dead things. So really, what I use for channel catfish is chicken livers, hot dogs, shrimp, corn, bread, really anything. Channel catfish will eat basically anything. You can even use small bait fish, you don't catch them. Next I'm going to talk about different types of bait to use for blue catfish. Now blue catfish, typically they're a little bit harder to catch and they are a little bit more pickier. Typically blue catfish like to eat small bait fish like minnows or shad. You can also catch them on other dead things like hot dogs or even livers. I wouldn't recommend using them for blue catfish though, mainly because they don't like them nearly as much. But you can catch, blues are a little bit harder to catch, but I would usually recommend using minnows for blues. Next is the flathead catfish. Now flathead catfish typically like to eat panfish like bass. They even like to eat sunfish and usually just bigger fish in general. You can also catch one night crawlers as well, but really flathead catfish are really picky. They're mainly harder to catch. So I would always recommend using sunfish for flathead catfish, or just any other different types of bigger bait fish. Now I will warn you though, if you do use sunfish for flathead catfish, I would always recommend checking your state regulation on certain bait fish. Some states really regulate on what types of bait you can use, what types of fish you can use for bait. Sometimes they'll only regulate the size. Sometimes they won't even let you use bait fish at all. So I would always recommend checking your state regulation before you start using bluegills or sunfish for bait. Now one thing I forgot to tell you guys is catfish. Typically, what most people don't know is catfish, they really don't have very good eyesight. Now mainly channel catfish don't have the best eyesight. Blue catfish and flathead catfish do have better eyesight, but it's mainly that channel catfish don't have the best eyesight, and mainly all catfish don't have good eyesight in general. But so basically, since they don't have good eyesight, they'll typically use their feelers or their whiskers on the side of their mouths basically to smell. So their primarily sense for them to find food is smell. So especially for channel catfish, mainly just use smell your baits. And for one thing I forgot to mention is for flatheads. Usually, if you're ever going to rig a sunfish, just always make sure it's still alive, because they can feel those vibrations that an injured sunfish will basically give off when it's injured. So I would always recommend just mainly using different types of baits for different types of catfish. Next, I'm going to talk about the different types of rig, the main rig to use for catfishing. Now, for catfishing, you can use different types of elaborate rigs, but really, I only use the single or the double rig. Now, this single or double rig basically just looks like this. this is basically what the single double rig looks like. As you can see, I have my bang sinker right here, and then I have my 2 hooks right here, and my swivel at the end. Now, basically, typically what most people do when they're catfishing is that they'll use braided line, and sometimes when you rig these with braided line, so if you rig these hooks with braided line, typically they'll start to go around each other, and when they start to go over and over each other, typically that'll create really big knots, and you'll practically just, your hook will be just in knots. So if you're going to use braided line, basically I would always recommend using a monofilament leader on the end to tie your hooks on, just so you don't get those annoying knots. Now first, I'm going to show you guys basically of how to tie a loop for a hook. So basically to tie I forgot to tell you this, guys. First, the type of materials that you're going to need is first your hook. Now this is a certain type of Gamakatsu circle hook. I would always recommend getting Gamakatsu. They make the best fishing hooks, especially circle hooks. Next, you need your sinkers. Now, a sinker that I would recommend using is the bang sinker. The bang sinker just overall bounces off just about any type of brush, and you just won't get caught on these. And next, you're going to need your swivel. Now, this type of swivel is called a crane swivel. You can get these at A.B.S. Pro, and they're pretty cheap as well, and you can get a bunch of these too. And then last is your line. I would always recommend using R-line. It's a monofilament brand. They sell other different types of line, but this is just, they mainly just make really good monofilament line. Okay, so now I'm going to show you guys of how to make the first loop to basically tie your hook onto. And this is basically what the loop is going to look like. And basically, this loop just allows you to basically just have your hook, basically you have your line, then your hook, and then the loop. This will basically just allow you to tie this hook onto your main line, to your reel. So I'm just going to show you basically how to tie this loop. Now I'm just going to use this thick string basically to show you guys on how to tie a loop, just so you guys can see it. Now first, what you're going to do is basically just get your line straightened out a little bit. Once you do that, just sort of make a loop at the end of your line. Make sure you have plenty of just end tags right here. It's just so you have plenty of room. Just sort of smooth those tags out then, and then just sort of make a circle like this. Oops, let me just do that over again. Just sort of make a circle like this. Once you have that circle, sort of like that, put the loop through that circle, and basically just pull it through. Just pull it tight. And that's basically what it'll look like. And basically just tie your hook on the end and you're ready to go. Now, once you tie this to your main line, basically, let me just get my line here. Basically, I have my main line here without the hook. Basically, what you first have to do with this is basically do what I just showed you to the main line. Basically, so you can have a loop to attach your hook to. Now make sure that these loops are spaced out evenly, especially when you're using double rigs. Just make sure your hook's not too close to the sinker, and it's not too close to other hooks so they don't get tangled up with each other. So just make sure you have plenty of space between your sinker and your different hooks. Just make that loop right there, flatten it out, and then put the loop through. And just pull it tight. And now you're ready to basically put your hook on your mainline hook to your main line. So basically just take your hook, basically just put your hook through the loop like this, and take your hook and go through the loop that has your line through it, that has your line attached to it. So basically like this, and then just sort of flatten that out, pull it tight, and you're good to go, and that won't come off. The only thing that'll break is your line. And that's basically the simple way to rig for catfishing. Basically, you can use other different types of rigs for that, but really, the double and single rig is basically the easiest way to do it, especially if you're starting out, and it's just a good rig in general. Next, I'm going to talk about the different types of rods and reels and line that you should use for catfishing. Now, for the main line that you're going to be using on your, that you're going to have on your spool, not your leader, I would always recommend using braided line. And for the brand, I would always recommend using Power Pro. Power Pro overall is one of the best braided line manufacturers. Really, I wouldn't recommend getting any other brand because Power Pro really, it's inexpensive and it has a really long shelf life. Now for the pound test, I would recommend using 20 pounds and above. I wouldn't recommend using any pound test lower than that, mainly because catfish are extremely strong, so they can basically tear your line real quick. So I would always recommend using a strong braid line. Now if you're a leader, just basically use monofilament, and I would always recommend going at least a 30 pound or above, mainly because that's your leader line and you're going to have a lot of tension on that. So I would always recommend using at least 30 pound test for your monofilament leader or above. Next I'm going to talk about the certain type of reel to use for catfishing. Now for catfishing, I would always recommend using a bait caster, mainly because a bait caster will allow you to basically put plenty of line on your reel that a spinner wouldn't. It's also, you can get a lot more strength into a bait caster. It allows you to reel in bigger fish, and really it just feels a lot better when especially when you're fishing for bigger fish. It feels a lot better to use a bait caster, and really it's a personal preference. That's what I really like to use. I would always recommend using a bait caster though, but really if you want to try a spinning reel, you can go for it then. Now for the rod, I would always recommend using, well, if you're going to use a spinner or bait caster rod, I would always recommend using a rod that's a medium to medium heavy, well, a medium heavy to heavy power with a fast action tip, and it's at least 6 foot 6 inches or lower actually. Mainly because I would always recommend using a rod that's 6 foot 6 inches or lower, mainly because a longer rod will basically have a tendency to break a lot easier with bigger fish, especially with catfish. Now a shorter rod will basically give you more backbone and is less likely to to break under strain for bigger catfish. Now for the rod that I usually use 2 catfishing rods. For the first one, and personally my favorite one, is basically I use a A.B.S. Ambassador baitcaster reel with a 5:3:1 gear ratio. And with the rod, I have a 6 foot 6 medium heavy ugly stick. And for rods and reels, honestly, you can ask your local tackle shop to recommend you guys a good rig for your catfishing, or you can just go out on your own. If you're ever going to get a catfishing rod, I would always recommend getting ugly stick. Ugly stick is extremely cheap. Typically, you can get them for around $40, and they're really strong rods. If you break, they're really hard to break, and they're really just good rods. Now, I have another catfishing rig, and typically this is the one that I use for deeper water or for just bigger catfish. It's just a thicker rod. This is a Catmax Bass Pro rod with a Shimano reel on it. This one isn't nearly as good as the other one. That one, my other rig, was a lot more expensive. This one I just typically use for deeper water situations and just for bigger catfish. This is a 7 foot rod. It's a heavy power with a fast action tip. And overall, it is a pretty good rod, but really it's not my favorite, mainly because it's pretty heavy. And after a while, it just gets to the point where it's a little bit too big, especially for fishing just normal catfish. So really, just always make sure that you're picking out the right rod and reel for your selection. You could always go to Bass Pro to get your recommendations. That's what I would recommend doing. But really, if you want to try to find your own rod and reel, go for it then. Next, I'm going to talk about different types of structures that catfish like to hang out in. Now, mainly it's, I forgot what I was going to say. So basically, catfish, typically some certain types of catfish will prefer certain types of structures. For example, flathead catfish, typically they like to hang around rocks and grass beds, mainly because rocks and grass beds will hold basically all the different types of game fish, like bass and panfish, and that's typically what they like to eat. So basically, flathead catfish, they'll typically hang around grass beds and rocks. Now for channels and blues, typically you can find them anywhere, wherever you're fishing. They really don't have a personal preference to where they'll hang out around. But really, one place that catfish love to hang out around is current. Current, basically, catfish like current mainly because basically the surging water basically gives oxygen to their gills, and they really like that. Basically, it just helps them keep them alive. Also, current basically brings food to them, mainly because they'll basically hang out around the calm areas, and then once the bait fish start swimming in through the current, they'll basically just sort of attack it. And really, current is one of the best places to find catfish at. And another thing that catfish like is warm water. Mainly because catfish like warm water. That's just one of the personal preferences that they really like. They just really like warm water. Typically through the seasons, usually around summer, early spring, And right around early fall as well is typically the best time to fish for catfish. And really, during the winter time, the catfish are really dormant. They don't really move around as much. They don't even eat that much. So really, late spring, all throughout the summer, and late fall, well, early fall is typically the best time to fish for catfish. Now that's pretty much what I wanted to cover over catfishing. Really, catfishing is really fun. If you never tried it out, I would always recommend trying it out. Especially if you're a bass fisherman, just always try catfishing out, try something new. It's really fun, it's easy, and especially if you know people that just don't fish and they want to get into it, catfishing is a really good way to get them into it, and because it's easy, and it's just really fun to do. And catfish will give you a fight that's a whole lot more than a bass could ever give you. Well, I hope this video was very informational to you guys. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys later.